All right, welcome back into the podcast. I am very excited to talk to this person, not just because he's a longtime NFL head coach. He coached in a Super Bowl, I believe, 2 times Coach of the Year, Head Coach of the Year, AP Coach of the Year, but because if you look at his Wikipedia page, it says he started his coaching career in 1997 with the Chicago Bears. But there is a select group of people that know he actually started his coaching career a couple years prior to that, helping out Barrington High School. And I was on that football team when Ron Rivera started coaching, and he joins me now. Coach Bill Zimmerman, how you doing?
Hey, Billy, good to see you, man. How you been?
I'm doing really well. I always bring that up to people. People are like, really? Ron Rivera was helping you coach? And it was a lot of fun. And the one thing that I still remember so much, because, the details of practices and everything, it's 30 years ago now, but your grasp of the game, and the Barrington High School football coaches were all very good. I mean, they went to state, 4 or 5 years after I left. So it was a good coaching staff, but your grasp of the game and how you relayed, footwork and pad level and all these important things that just, like, my 17-year-old brain who, thought he knew so much about football just like really opened up to like, wow, like the knowledge that the NFL players have and their experience is just, it's at another level if you've never been able to just pick someone's brain like that.
Well, I appreciate that, Bill. And, the big thing, and I still do believe this, that the base fundamentals, the basics of the game are really, if you're really, really good at it, you can always fall back to those if things get tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so when did you know, I know you retired, I think you did a little television in Chicago. When did you know you wanted to get into coaching?
When I started working with kids, when I started working with you guys, I coached the Pee Wee team. Glenn Kozlowski got me started coaching Pee Wee football. And, he's part of the reason I got into coaching was because I really, truly enjoyed it. And I just felt, I have to take my shot. I'll never know if I don't take my shot. And that's what I did. Fortunate enough, at the time, Dave Wanstead was the head coach. He gave me an opportunity to come in and be part of what he was trying to do. And so my first 2 years, I actually got to work for the Bears as a coach back in 1997.
All right. So I was an offensive lineman, but I wore 76 because my favorite trench player was Steve McMichael. So I wanted to have you on because, as far as I can tell, you may be the only person that had, detailed relationships with these 3 Chicago Bears that are up for the Hall of Fame this year. And of course, Steve McMichael, and we've all been following his battle with ALS closely. Yeah. And he's unbelievably strong, and it's incredible that he's been able to stay with us for this long, and hopefully everything goes well. And it seems like, I've heard it's a rubber stamp. He's going to make it for sure on that senior committee. But I wanted to ask you about playing with him because he was just such a dynamic player, and his just, I always felt like, I know there were a lot of guys between Singletary and Hampton and a lot of guys like that, but it always felt like me that he was that engine of that mid-'80s Chicago Bears defense.
You put that very, very succinctly, because if you really do look at the guys that have gotten into the Hall of Fame that have all been part of what I was fortunate enough to be around back in the early 80s, mid 80s, it was phenomenal. But Steve McMichael, is probably a good way to put it, he was the engine. He was the glue. And what was interesting about it, too, because if you look at it, because we had, Dan Hampton, we had Richard Dent, who were so dynamic on that defensive line, but we had Steve McMichael, who did the dirty work. The absolute dirty work. He's the guy that hunkered in there, dropped anchor, held his point, allowed the linebackers to run, allowed Hampton, allowed Dent to get vertical, and then he would push that pocket, and those guys would get all the glory. And Steve just went about his business. And I think, when you look at a Hall of Fame guy, one of the things is, he may be one of the best players on the team, but Steve McMichael was the best player for the team. This is a guy that helped elevate everybody else's play because of his unselfish way of playing the football game. And that was probably the most important thing about Steven, was that he was so unselfish and he helped to make other guys around him better.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. And I know, and I've heard Mike Singletary talk about how much space he had to work with because of guys like McMichael and stuff up front.
Billy, let me tell you a quick funny story, okay? Back in 1986, I got my first start for the Bears as a middle linebacker. Mike was hurt, so I got a chance to start. We were playing Detroit at home. I led the team in tackles. Coach Dicka gives me a game ball for leading the team in tackles that day. And so what happened was, when he gives me the game ball, Steve McMichael says, well, maybe it's not the guy behind us, but it's the two guys in front of him. So him and Hamp had a nice little chuckle about that. But that's kind of the way Steve looked at things, is that Steve really did help and did allow people to go and play football, and he did make us better.
Yeah, that's great. And like, he's waited so long for this opportunity, and I don't know what made him underrated, because, and like you said, he did a lot of the dirty work, but it's not like he didn't get, sacks on his own. I think I saw that he's third in sacks amongst defensive tackles behind Aaron Donald and John Randall, I think is the other one. I mean, that's some great company to be with. So, like, is it because Hampton and Dent were Hall of Famers and you can't put three? Like, what do you think held McMichael back?
And you're probably onto something there, Billy. But if you really do think about it, you got Hampton, you got Dent, and you got Singletary behind him. So again, when you've got those three guys, you got a trifecta. Now you add the fourth guy, the guy, like I said, that did the dirty work, that allowed the other guys to do the things that they did. You got to recognize him. And I think that, that unfortunately it took time. It really did. And that was because, he wasn't flashy. You know what I'm saying? If you hadn't mentioned that he was third all time in defensive tackles, most people go, what? Wait a minute, he was third? So I think that was probably a big part of it, was that he wasn't getting all the headlines. He wasn't the flashy guy. He wasn't like, one of the faces of the defensive unit, and which is kind of hard to say, because he really was one of the iconic guys.
Yeah, he really was. And speaking of iconic defensive linemen, another guy I want to ask you about is Julius Peppers, who, of course, spent a few years in Chicago. You had the opportunity to coach him later in his career when he came back to Carolina. And I mean, this guy was just a physical freak, a physical specimen. That, he was a phenomenal basketball player in college. There was so much athleticism behind him. Like, what made him, beyond just the athletic makeup of him, what made him such a special football player?
I think was really the way he played. He played hard. He played physical. He played fast. He played smart. He used his athletic ability. Not only did he play defensive end, but sometimes he'd end up as a three technique. Sometimes he'd end up all the way down at the nose, and that was just based on movement by the offensive line. But here's a guy that pretty much played all along that line. And then he even dropped into coverage a few times, because he had a few interceptions that he returned for touchdowns. Then they moved him over to tight end, and in goal line situations, they'd have him run a fade or a quick look in and throw it up high and let him go rebound it. And that just spoke again to his athleticism and his abilities. But he was also one of those guys that did help the players around him play better. And so I think, again, when you recognize a guy with that kind of ability, that kind of a talent, and the kind of career he had, you have to recognize that guy and put that guy in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and this is his first opportunity, and I would expect him to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I'm going to say this, and it may sound dumb, as a guy that I expect to be a first ballot Hall of Famer and who wrecked games and everything, but I still almost feel like Julius Peppers is underrated in my opinion. Like, I feel like he should be in that. I'm not saying he's Reggie White, but I feel like he should be in that breath of those all-time pass rushers. And you don't hear his name brought up at that level. He's obviously great. People recognize his greatness, but in kind of the things you were talking about, I think he's even underappreciated in some aspects.
I think a better word is underappreciated, just because, again, he really isn't flamboyant. He isn't flashy. He's not, you sit there and you talk about things. You remember the people that are flashy. You remember the people that stand out beyond the game. I mean, in the game, you could bring him up and say, that's right, that's the kind of player he was. But you sit there and don't say, well, I remember when he flashed and did this, and he was out there and doing these commercials and getting that kind of recognition. That wasn't Julius, and he's never really been like that. But he's a guy that is very well deserving just because of the way he played the game.
All right. Well, last person I want to ask you about, and I think probably most interesting for Bears fans, and not because of, he's recent and exciting, but because I think a lot of Bears fans are expecting, positive results for Steve McMichael and Julius Peppers. But Devin Hester is definitely more on the bubble. And I know when the arguments first came up a few years ago, is, well, you can't just put, a guy who returned kicks and punts in the Hall of Fame. But, if we're going to put Ray Guy in the Hall of Fame, everyone assumes Adam Vinatieri's going in. There's other kickers in. If you're going to put specialists in, the guy who's the greatest returner of all time, who's got more return touchdowns than Deion Sanders, who also has interception returns in his touchdown total, it's a no-brainer to me. And I'm hoping Devin doesn't have to wait any longer, because he was such a special special talent. And I think as someone who was the defensive coordinator when he came in, it probably just completely impacted how you guys, plan for games.
Oh, most certainly. And the thing that you have to look at is you have to judge him for what he does and how he impacted the game with his limited opportunities. That's the thing that's amazing. I can remember him taking over a game when we played the Rams down in St. Louis when they were still in St. Louis. He returned a punt, he returned a kickoff for touchdowns. I can remember him making an impact in the Arizona game on the infamous "we knew who they were." So again, you go back and think about the way and his limited opportunities, he made the most of them. And that's why a guy like that most certainly should be in the Hall of Fame, because he impacts it. And there are so many other returners that are out there that, people forget that these guys were the kind of guys that made impacts in the game because they changed field position. The quick hit score, 8 seconds later, 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, the game's tied, or they've taken the lead and extended it because of a great return. And they're all throughout the league, and we for whatever reason, you can't have a guy like that. He's only out there once in a while. Well, if he's only out there once in a while, but yet his impact is felt, you got to really consider that guy. How he changes field position, how he changes the tempo of the game, how he sets the tempo of the game on the first opening kickoff in the Super Bowl. He returns a kickoff and changes the tempo early on. So again, you have to judge him for that, as well as as anybody else you're looking at saying, well, the only time he only caught touchdowns. Okay, that's what they said about Chris Carter. But no, it's every time Chris Carter was out there was always a threat that he could go for a touchdown. Sure. So when you look at how the guys impact games, those are the people that you sit there and you say, that's a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not just the touchdowns; it's the other impact he can have. And that Super Bowl team with you and Lovey, that was obviously, we all know that was a defensive team. That the defense led the way that year. And I know Rex had a couple good years, a couple good games throwing the football, and the offense could score some points. But I mean, let's not be mistaken that the offense was couple steps further back than the defense. And what Devin Hester provided, being able to shorten the field or force you to kick the ball out of bounds where you only may get a 30, 35 yard net because you don't want him to touch the football. The things that he was able to do to boost the offense and shorten the field for the offense and make it a lot more manageable for an offense that's probably not going to go 9 plays, 80 yards for the score. I mean, that had to help you with so many victories, that season.
Oh, without a doubt. And that's the thing everybody has to understand, is that guys that they impact the game in fear sometimes. I mean, sometimes guys look at it and they sit there and say, man, we can't kick to them. We got to do something else, and it does change the way people approach the game. And that's the other big part that people have to understand, is that, it's not just when they have the ball in their hands, but it's how do they affect other people, and the way people look at games, say, man, we can't do this or we can't do that. And they're only talking about a returner, but a special returner. And that's the thing I think people have to understand.
Yeah, he really was. It looks like we lost your video, but the audio is good, and just have a couple more with you. But I just wanted to ask you. Oh, Coach is back. When you guys drafted Devin and it was a second round selection, I mean, was there plans to have him play corner, or was it more just the focus of knowing how good he was as a returner?
It was both. I mean, and again, got to give a lot of credit to Lovie Smith and our scouting department, because, the thought was this guy was such an explosive, dynamic player that we had to first have him on the field any way possible. Okay. And we had him at corner, and he was dynamic and explosive, but he was a guy that had to learn the position, because he had played running back at Miami as well, and he was a returner there. So they switched him over, had him do some things on offense where he played wide receiver, where he played some running back stuff. And the thing that, and again, I really think that when you look at, what transitioned, or what came about that created the opportunity for him to be so dynamic, more so than anything else, was that on special teams, he was a running back that could, that was a guy people didn't want to tackle. You think about it, it's a kickoff, it's a 40-yard sprint down there to cover it, and you got a running back that's got to, 20, 30-yard sprint after he catches it. And, it's a high impact collision. And Dave Tobe, the special teams coach, and I remember him telling this to Devin, just saying, now remember, Devin, during the cold, when it gets cold, that's going to be your advantage because people aren't going to want to make contact with you, especially if you got a full head of steam. I mean, think about how many arm tackles he broke.
Sure.
Again, you have to be a big, stout body to run through arm tackles consistently, and that's what he did.
Yeah, he was just so fun to watch too. It's just, it's a lot of those things, if you're watching the game at home and you're going to go to the, it's 4th and 8. So it's time to go run to the bathroom or get a drink out of the fridge. Not if Devin Hester was back there, that was, or if you're in the game, you're going to wait in line for the beer or the bathroom because you have to be there for Devin Hester's return.
And you know how many times I heard people say that is that, the worst part is I got to go to the restroom, but I would sit and wait till the punt. And after they punt it, then I would go to the restroom. I said, well, you might miss something in the office. They go, well, maybe not. So it was kind of interesting. But, the thing that's interesting too, and again, you said it earlier about the need to have more specialists in the Hall of Fame. I mean, because you also got to think about the guys that set the tone, Billy White Shoes Johnson,
sure,
Brian Mitchell. I mean, there's some great returners that haven't got their due or it takes way too long for them to get their due. So, if Devin gets in, I think it might help open doors for guys that deserve it as well. I mean, Brian Mitchell, I'm up here in Washington, and I know the impact he had. I was on the coaching staff in Philadelphia when he was there for a few years, and the impact he made there. And then coming here and listening to the impact he made, that's a guy that people need to really take a look at his career and see how he impacted the game, not just as a running back, but as a guy that returned punts and kicks. I mean, he is a dynamic player as well. So
absolutely,
I agree with what you said, Billy. They need to take a nice, good, steady look at Devin because I really do think he deserves it.
Absolutely. I think you made a good point that could open up doors for some other deserving candidates. So last thing for you before I let you go, and I really appreciate you joining me. I just had to ask you one question about Montez Sweat because, obviously you had an opportunity to coach him for a few years there. And I think Chicago as a whole, fans and media, underrated him. And I think some people said, oh, that was a steep price to pay to get him over here. And I think everyone expected him to be good, but he elevated this defense in a way that I don't think a lot of people expected. He was an absolute animal. The pressures, he elevated Tremaine Edmonds behind him. He elevated DeMarcus Walker beside him. He had such a big impact on the game. I mean, he led Washington and Chicago in sacks this year. Yes. I think that's the first time that's ever happened in NFL history. He is an incredible asset, and I think Ryan Poles made a really smart move bringing him over from your squad.
He did, and again, it was kind of a shift in the thought process and how to build, the team here. But the one thing about, a man of his ability is you have to now account for him. So teams, when they're game planning and they sit there and they look at Montez, they go, man, we've got to be able to answer that question. We got to turn the center to him all the time, or we got to step the back or we got to put a tight end over there. We got to rig our protections to him, and now they forget about the other guys, or because of his great abilities to get upfield, force that quarterback to step up into the pocket. The interior rushers now affect the passing game. So, his effect just isn't what he does, but how he affects his other guys. I mean, again, this is a guy that's, probably the best player for his team because he does those things. He helps elevate his teammates.
Yeah, absolutely. In that same breath of Steve McMichael and Julius Peppers that we talked about before. Well, there he is, longtime NFL head coach, of course, of Carolina and Washington, Ron Rivera. Coach, thanks for joining me here. I really enjoyed the conversation and best of luck in the future.
Appreciate it, Billy. Good talking to you again, kiddo.